Alors, je vous propose de reprendre. Et donc, je me présente, je suis Bertrand Ruymbeke, professeur de civilisation américaine à l'Université de Paris-8. Et je suis très heureux de présider cette séance et je suis également très content que mes co-organisatrices aient accepté mon idée de proposer une présentation de cet ouvrage. D'une part parce que je travaille avec le professeur Stanwood depuis de nombreuses années, et d'autre part parce qu'il a publié un ouvrage que voici, donc, dont il va nous parler, dont je dirai quelques mots, qui touche à un sujet sur lequel j'ai travaillé pendant des années. Et également, on verra que d'une certaine manière, le professeur Stanwood est allé plus loin dans des démonstrations que j'avais faites il y a une quinzaine d'années, est allé plus loin, et j'expliquerai pourquoi. En fait, son livre est une grande avancée pour ceux qui s'intéressent à la diaspora des protestants français, donc connus sous divers noms. Hein. Nous, on dit simplement en France protestants, parce qu'on a une vue un peu uniforme du protestantisme, alors que dans les pays protestants, ils sont connus comme alors soit Huguenots en Grande-Bretagne, ou alors Huguenots en Amérique. Donc, c'est un sujet qui intéresse beaucoup nos collègues américains et britanniques, allemands aussi et hollandais. Hein. Donc, cette diaspora des protestants français à la fin du XVIIe siècle et par grappe, on peut dire, de migrants au cours du XVIIIe. Alors, c'est un sujet qui est lié à la marginalité, parce que dans l'histoire de France, les protestants, bien sûr, sont perçus comme à la marge. Or, il y a eu un roi, Henri IV, qui était un chef militaire protestant et qui, bien sûr, a dû se convertir au catholicisme pour devenir roi de France dans les années 1590. Et donc, l'histoire de leur marginalité se déroule tout au long du XVIIe siècle, où ils vont être marginalisés. Et ensuite, en 1685, avec la révocation d'édit de Nantes, il va y avoir une volonté royale d'unifier le royaume d'un point de vue religieux. Il y aura une tentative d'absorption du protestantisme. Et finalement, à peu près 180 000 d'entre eux vont quitter la France. Et pour des destinations qui pourraient être vues comme marginales, hein, parce que dans l'océan Indien, ou en Amérique, ou en Amérique du Nord, ou au Suriname, en Afrique du Sud, mais dans ces colonies, ils vont petit à petit jouer un rôle central, en fait. Et c'est bien sûr l'objet du livre d'Owen Stanwood. Alors, donc, Owen Stanwood est professeur à Boston College, un professeur d'histoire moderne. Il a publié un premier livre en 2011 sur la glorieuse révolution en Amérique, hein, qui s'intitule The Empire Reformed, English America in the Age of the Glorious Revolution. Et là, en 2020, il a publié donc cet ouvrage, The Global Refuge, hein, Huguenots in an Age of Empire, chez Oxford University Press. Et donc, c'est une vision globale de la diaspora des Huguenots. Donc, bienvenue à toi, Owen, et je te laisse la parole. Et merci d'être avec nous, virtuellement au moins.
Merci, Bertrand. I'm very happy to be here today. I'd like to thank Bertrand and the organizers for inviting me. I'm just sorry, of course, that I can't be there in person, and because of the time difference, I unfortunately couldn't attend any of the sessions this morning. But I hope that I can discuss my book, but also talk about the connections with some of the themes of marginality in the Americas more generally. Colonial North America was a marginal place. In the terminology favored by many historians, it was a periphery attached to a distant metropolitan core. The core-periphery dynamic worked in various ways. It was initially economic and political. The colonial peripheries produced raw materials for European markets, and in the theoretical constructs of mercantilist thought, these places were entirely subservient to metropolitan whims. They existed, after all, to bring wealth and power to a distant king. Moreover, such political marginality could translate into cultural marginality. The colonies were, to put it bluntly, very weird places, pale imitations of the European societies that birthed them. One of these weirdnesses from a European point of view was the colony's cultural diversity. They were filled with indigenous and enslaved African people who had great effects on social development. But they were culturally weird in other ways too. Colonies tended to attract any number of European misfits, from religious dissenters to poor, turbulent young men to political radicals. Colonial societies, marginal as they were, filled up with people from Europe's margins. When they got to the colonies, however, these marginal people found themselves in somewhat new circumstances. They were not always necessarily on the margins anymore. To put it in somewhat convoluted terms, on the colonial margins, Europe's marginal people could become important, even dominant. The most storied example of this phenomenon concerned English religious minorities. The Puritans, for instance, were a minority in England, if a powerful one. In New England, they became the rulers, and their opponents within the Church of England became embattled minorities, pushed to the margins of New England society. Similar phenomena happened in Maryland, where English Catholics, who could not even practice freely at home, became the colony's rulers, or in Pennsylvania, where the embattled and radical Quakers constructed William Penn's Holy Experiment. These were just some of the most extreme examples of what was a general colonial pattern. In the colonies, persecuted people could find not just refuge, but dominance. Indeed, they could even become the persecutors themselves, as the Puritans amply demonstrated. Why did this happen? Why was the periphery such a promised land for marginal people? The most obvious argument would be that state power was weak on the peripheries. Of course, early modern states were not as powerful as their modern equivalents anywhere, but they were in the process of consolidating, and part of that task was guaranteeing uniformity, whether in terms of politics or religion. On the peripheries, however, that authority was just weaker, giving dissidents some space. Today, I want to test this proposition using the story of one particular group of people who were the subject of my recent book, whose cover you see here, but that you've already seen in physical form from Bertrand. And the subject of my book, of course, is the Huguenots. During the late 17th and 18th centuries, a number of French Protestants settled in British colonial America. Their numbers were not large, perhaps 5,000 came over a few decades, and that is a high estimate. Nonetheless, they became quite important. British officials competed to attract French settlers, offering good terms to those willing to cross the ocean. Once they reached the New World, moreover, some Huguenots rose to positions of influence within British institutions. Some were leading merchants, others were active in the Church of England, a few even became colonial governors. Today I want to tell the story of how this happened, of how a seemingly marginal group gained influence and power, and what this tells us about the larger place of dissidents and minorities on the edges of the Atlantic world. Not to skip to the ending too quickly, but the Huguenots helped demonstrate that the colonies could indeed be a promised land for refugees, but not for the reasons or in the manner that one might expect. Now, to understand the forces that brought the Huguenots to America, we must start in France. After the end of the Wars of Religion in 1598, the kingdom's Protestants were in a protected but decidedly marginal position. The Huguenots made up around 10% of the population, and the Edict of Nantes, a royal proclamation intended to bring peace to the realm, strictly limited their social and political role. The Huguenots could not expand beyond their present bounds, and by law held an inferior place. In short, France would be a Catholic kingdom where Protestants could be tolerated but never dominant. This position only got worse over the course of the 17th century. First, Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu took away the Huguenots' fortified towns, which had given them a means of defending themselves. Then, beginning in 1660, Louis XIV began chipping away at the Edict of Nantes, eliminating many of the Huguenots' legal protections. Their temples were destroyed, and many of their paths to professional or political advancement were blocked. The result was a wave of mass conversions, as ambitious Protestants decided that their professional advancement was worth a mass. All of this culminated in the 1680s, and these two images give some sense of what happened. First, in 1681, the Intendant of Poitou instituted dragonnades, royal troops who occupied Protestant homes and forced them to convert to Catholicism to make the terror stop. And this is a cartoon from the 1680s demonstrating that. At the same time, the king escalated his legal campaign against Protestantism, culminating in the complete revocation of the Edict of Nantes in October 1685. Protestantism was now illegal in a kingdom that was, officially at least, tout catholique. Most Protestants acquiesced, becoming officially Catholic, but a minority chose flight, as you can see on the image to your right. This was a risky option since the revocation explicitly forbade the king's formerly Protestant subjects from leaving France, but nearly 150,000 people took the risk anyway. They stowed away on ships out of La Rochelle and Dieppe, or they snuck out overland to Geneva. The result was a refugee crisis that was nearly unprecedented in early modern Europe. The newcomers, many of them poor, crowded into cities around Protestant countries. Thousands came through Switzerland, moving from there on to Germany. Many others went to Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, while London had its own large Huguenot community. Once they reached Refuge, however, the Huguenots found themselves marginal in new ways. True, they were now surrounded by other Protestants, many of whom admired the French newcomers for their steadfastness in the face of persecution. Nonetheless, the Huguenots were cultural outsiders, and ones with little money and few connections. Gaining employment was tough in cities that were still dominated by craft guilds. The solution to this problem was to try and form colonies, rural Huguenot enclaves where they could practice their faith and have some degree of autonomy. The most successful colonies formed in Brandenburg and other parts of Germany in the 1680s, but the model appeared elsewhere as well, even in Ireland. Still, it depended on the supply of free land, and that gradually dried up. The problem can be seen in a poignant petition by a man named Sondreville, who told authorities in Zurich in the late 1690s that he had, quote, wandered through all of Europe in search of bread, but could no longer find help in any place. So what to do if Europe was full? The Huguenots would have to get more imaginative. One obvious alternative was to look overseas to European empires. There was plenty of land for the taking, and English and Dutch officials were eager to find settlers. Moreover, this was something that many Huguenots had experience with. The first French colonies back in the 16th century had been planned by Huguenots, and they had always played a leading role in French expansion. They had done so for predictable reasons. Even if they didn't explicitly seek to form separate Huguenot colonies, they thought they would have more rights and power on the margins. In 1627, Cardinal Richelieu cut off this possibility in Canada. Settlers there would have to be Catholic. This did not mean that no Huguenots went to the French colonies. Many settled in the Caribbean, for instance. But it would not be a place where Protestants could dominate. But now, with the Huguenots in exile, the British and Dutch empires could become what the French Empire never could. By moving to someone else's empire, Huguenots could find a number of things. The ability to practice their faith, of course, but also an economic competency, and above all, a chance to be more than a tolerated minority. As one Huguenot colonial theorist put it, it was better for French Protestant people to live, quote, among people of the same language, same nation, and same religion. And perhaps the only place that Huguenots could check all three of these boxes was in remote outposts in the West or East Indies, where they could be, if not quite the only people, then at least a higher percentage of the people than they would be back in Europe. In the end, a minority of Huguenots, perhaps 5 to 10,000, chose to move overseas beyond Europe. It was a big move, of course, far more difficult than moving to Germany or Ireland. But those refugees who did end up overseas at least had the possibility of building new colonies where they would no longer be on the margins. Some went to the Dutch Cape Colony in southern Africa, others to Suriname in South America or the Caribbean. But I want to focus for the rest of my talk today on British North America, the set of colonies stretching from New England to South Carolina. This became a particular magnet for the refugees, attracting some 1,000 of them some thousands of them over a couple of decades. Now, the Huguenot move to British America came about through a complicated dance between British colonial proprietors and the Huguenots themselves. Both sides engaged in something of a propaganda war. The British sought to show how wonderful their respective colonies were, trying to tempt the Huguenots into a transatlantic move. The Huguenots, on the other hand, bragged of their own greatness as godly, productive people, basically the perfect subjects. Both of these propaganda campaigns were pretty successful and put the refugees in a good position as they began their American sojourn. Let's start with the British. Around 1680, they had a robust and growing American empire that now stretched hundreds of miles up and down the American seaboard. But from the perspective of the imperial center, it was underdeveloped. Some parts, like New England, were filled with recalcitrant people who often ignored regulations. Others, like Carolina, had few people and no cash crops. There was also a robust debate going on about the utility of overseas colonies. Some political economists spoke passionately about the benefits of producing new luxury goods in America, thus improving England's balance of trade. Others worried that the colonies would drain England of too many of its people, thus causing the decline of the domestic economy. People like the Huguenots offered a possible way out of this dilemma. They were not from England, after all, but they were Protestant, so they could fit in well enough. They also seemed to have some of the skills and aptitudes that would help them to prosper in the colonies. Most especially, the Huguenots could make things that the British desperately wanted to consume. Political economists gravitated towards two particular commodities, silk and wine. Both were favored by the English upper classes, but they could not be produced at home. Most wine came from France, while much silk did as well. By consuming this stuff, the English ruined their balance of trade and handed over their money to their biggest rival. Now, however, England itself was filling up with French people, many of whom were out of work. Perhaps they could be put to work making this French stuff that the English so desired. Some of this could be done in England itself. For example, many French silk workers set up in the East London neighborhood of Spitalfields. But if one wanted to make raw silk or grow grapes, it simply could not be done in a cold, wet climate like England. Carolina and Virginia, on the other hand, lay at the same latitude as Italy or China. Maybe it could be done there. So the English started a major propaganda push to convince Huguenots to go to their colonies, and you see two examples of it here in this slide. The most dedicated were the organizers of Pennsylvania and especially Carolina, which desperately needed settlers and new sources of revenue. The tracts, which were written in French, both printed and in manuscript form, emphasized various things. They invariably stressed that migrants would have complete freedom of conscience. Some promised naturalization so the newcomers could enjoy political rights. They all lauded the ease of life and plethora of economic opportunities in the colonies. Many of them were quite specific about what kinds of opportunities existed, especially in making silk, wine, and olive oil. One French writer, Charles de Rochefort, noted that some French families were already making silk in Carolina as early as 1681, while another, Durand of Dauphiné, who wrote the tract that you see there on the right, described the opportunities for settlers who wanted to make wine in the Virginia Piedmont. These places appeared perfect not just for settlers, but for French settlers in particular. This helps us move to the other kind of propaganda that was going on, the Huguenots propagandizing about themselves. Rochefort and Durand clearly implied that the French were the best people to realize these dreams of a new empire built on new cash crops, and other refugee leaders used even more overblown language in their petitions. The Huguenots were chosen people, not just in a religious sense, but in an economic one. They were all raised in vineyards, several of them claimed. They were productive people with special talents. Of course, a lot of this wasn't technically true. The first and in some ways emblematic petitioners, two gentlemen named Jacob Gerard and René Petit, were from Normandy, a region little known for silk and wine. More than that, many of them were merchants or other professionals rather than artisans or farmers. Nonetheless, the English really wanted to believe that all French people naturally knew how to make silk and wine, and the Huguenots did nothing to disavow their patrons of this belief. All of this meant that the Huguenots came to enjoy a somewhat privileged position in the American colonies. They were the quintessential good immigrants, people with the skills and character to build the empire. But it went even further than that. Aside from being religious heroes and economic supermen, they also leveraged their geopolitical expertise. In 1689, England and France went to war, and that conflict, known as the War of the League of Augsburg, stretched from Europe to America. This could be bad news for Huguenots. They were French, and there was a great deal of anti-French prejudice in the English world in the 1690s. But they also worked to turn their Frenchness into an asset. The Huguenots claimed that as people who knew France well, only they could overcome it. The British Empire needed insiders who could give expert advice on how to bring down their French rivals. There are lots of ways that this could work, but I want to focus on one example. From the 1680s onward, English commentators noted the frightening ability of the French to build robust alliances with Native American nations. Once war came, it was these indigenous warriors, rather than actual French soldiers, who did much of the fighting. The English quickly came to believe that religion had something to do with it. The French had built a system of Indian missions, mostly staffed by those soldiers of the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits, that brought in a number of new Christians. For instance, two of the confederacies closest to New England, the Abenaki and Iroquois, saw large numbers of their people become Catholic and move to New France. The English obsessed over this circumstance. Puritan ministers in particular wanted to bring natives into the Protestant camp, which would presumably also make them allies. But the Puritans just weren't very good missionaries. For whatever reason, Indians did not want to become Protestants. In the 1690s, some of the administrators responsible for missions came on a new idea. England abounded with unemployed Huguenot ministers. Many of them didn't speak much English, which made them useless in English parishes, and there weren't enough Huguenot churches to employ them all. But what if they could go and become missionaries? These ministers could then win the natives not just for Christ, but for England, and help win the war with France. There was a little bit of sense to these proposals. After all, many northeastern natives did know some French, so the Huguenots could more easily communicate with them than English ministers could. Still, most of it was based on little more than stereotypes. Jesuit missionaries were French, and the Jesuits were effective missionaries. The Huguenots were also French, thus they would have to be good missionaries as well. It was basically the same logic at work as in the rhetoric of silk and wine. At least some French people were willing to go along with this particular fantasy. And I want to talk about one in particular, a minister named Ezekiel Carrey, the author of the two books whose title pages you see here. In 1686, he arrived in America as minister of a Huguenot community at Narragansett in the colony of Rhode Island. The colony proved to be short-lived. The French got into a land dispute with English neighbors who essentially intimidated the Huguenots into leaving. Certainly, the refugees' ethnic identity didn't help. New Englanders hated the French, especially during wartime, and while the refugees were supposedly Protestants, who knew for sure? Maybe they were spies. Carrey moved with many members of the community to Boston, where he became minister of the city's French church. He also made it his special project to improve the reputation of the Huguenots in the region, to show that rather than being possible spies, they were actually critical allies in the fight against France. To accomplish this task, Carrey teamed up with a well-known Puritan minister named Cotton Mather. They collaborated first on a publication in English, that you see on the left here, that among other things told the story of the persecution of the Huguenots and explained why they were Protestant heroes. After that, they began working together on an even bigger project. Mather had come into possession of some curious manuscripts. They consisted of several catechisms and manuscript religious writings, as well as correspondence between Jesuit missionaries working among the Iroquois. Since a lot of the material was in French, Mather shared it with Carrey for his opinion. Eventually, the two men collaborated on a new publication, this time in French, that would both publish the materials, thus revealing the Jesuits' methods, and offer an expert's testimony on what they were doing. In his sections of the book, Carrey was doing two things. One was continuing to make the point that the Huguenots were not enemies of the English, but friends. They were just as opposed to the machinations of the Jesuits and Louis XIV as their English neighbors, if not more so. But more than that, Carrey presented himself as a special expert, someone who could understand what the Jesuits were up to. He had lived, after all, in the belly of the beast. He and his people had faced the same campaign to convert from Jesuits and Catholics, and many of them had resisted. Who better to offer advice and counsel as New Englanders faced off against their own Catholic threat? Carrey did not himself volunteer to go off and convert the natives, but his writings confirmed what many already suspected, that French people had particular aptitude as missionaries. Two of Carrey's fellow ministers actually accepted money from English donors to start up a mission in the Massachusetts town of Oxford. Now, these two examples of silk and wine and Indian missions help demonstrate how the Huguenots rose to positions of prominence in British America. Their patrons tended to believe that they had special skills that would help develop the region, and the Huguenots themselves were effective self-promoters. But there were obvious problems. Dreams of silk and wine, or dreams of converting Indians that could help bring Huguenots to America, but they could not necessarily make their communities prosper. For one thing, the settlers who came to America were bound to have some rude awakenings. They might face belligerent neighbors, like in the Rhode Island colony. But even if not, there was the inconvenient fact that many of the people who moved to America simply didn't have the skills they claimed to have. Many in Carolina, for instance, tried to grow vines or make silk, but these efforts were nearly all failures. True, the climate had a lot to do with it. The swampy low country was not very similar to Languedoc. But another problem was the lack of expertise. This was also true beyond agriculture. The two ministers in Oxford, for example, proved to be lousy missionaries. By 1700, the second of them, Jacques Laborie, essentially gave up when a bunch of his native proselytes told him that Catholicism was, quote, more beautiful than Protestantism, and that the Jesuits gave them silver crosses to put around their necks. Being French did not give Laborie a talent for conversion. What all of this meant is that the Huguenot communities in America did not live up to the great expectations of either their French founders or their English patrons. The settlers quickly gave up on specialized pursuits like silk, wine, or missionary work, and simply started imitating their English neighbors. In Carolina, they planted rice, in Virginia, tobacco. In rural New England, they became small farmers, and in Boston and New York, they were merchants or artisans. Their communities never grew big enough to become dominant, except in some corners of South Carolina, and they shrunk very quickly as many refugees chose to leave the Huguenot colonies to live on their own among the English. The result was that remaining Huguenot towns were on the margins of the margins. One clear example is Mannequin town in Virginia, founded in 1700. When visitors went to the town located on the frontier of the colony, they found a struggling outpost of poor farmers, largely cut off from the rest of Virginia or the wider Atlantic world. They were poor, but they got by, said their chief English patron. It would appear that moving to America had perhaps not been quite the windfall that some had imagined. But this was not the end of the story. Instead, in the 18th century, the Huguenots adapted to life in English America and took a new approach. They gave up on the old goal of maintaining special French communities, independent enclaves within someone else's state. Instead, they blended in. The refugees essentially became English, adopting most of the outward values of their host society. And they were quite good at it. Indeed, the Huguenots are now primarily known above all for the speed of their assimilation. But this assimilation was neither simple nor complete. For one thing, they became not just ordinary English people, but extraordinary ones. Many of them were able to rise to positions of great power on the edges of the British Empire. More than that, even as they outwardly assimilated, some of them continued to use their French connections to good effect. In short, Huguenots in British America became prominent not in spite of being Huguenots, but because of it. I want to demonstrate this in a couple of different ways. First, I want to tell the story of a quintessential urban Huguenot, a successful merchant from a leading family. Not surprisingly, merchants were some of the key members of early America's French community. Many of them, like Gabrielle Bernal of Boston and Providence, settled in America partly because he had long-standing trade ties to New France. Living nearby could be a very good way to carry on that trade. and many did, surreptitiously operating in French colonies, even though they were not legally allowed to do so. Other merchant families were far more far-flung, operating around the Atlantic world. These refugees were able to rise to prominent positions in Anglo-American society precisely because of these connections, which depended on French networks and even extended into France itself. The example I want to focus on is the Jay family, and especially its second-generation patriarch, Peter Jay. His father, Auguste, was from a La Rochelle merchant family, and he settled in New York City, which you see kind of what that would have looked like in the 18th century here, which became a magnet for Huguenots. When Peter approached adulthood in the 17 teens, his father began grooming him for the family business. This involved a lot of overseas travel. He spent time living with his cousins in Bristol, in England's West Country, one of the key ports in England's American trade. Then he moved on to France, visiting relatives in both Paris and La Rochelle, reconnecting with the family, and doubtless figuring out ways to link his family business with France itself. This was an interesting moment. France and England had finally stopped fighting in 1713, which opened up new trade opportunities. But Peter Jay's French relations were all Catholics, and there's no evidence to suggest that they were faking it. So in this case, family and business could sometimes trump religion, at least when it came to building wealth. Once Peter returned home, he put these connections to work. His Bristol cousins remained his main trading partners for decades. They would send manufactured goods from the West Country and sometimes flax and linen from Ireland, where they had separate trade connections, probably through the sizable Huguenot community there. Peter sold their goods and sent back a number of American goods, especially sugar from Jamaica that he obtained with the help of, you guessed it, another French business partner. In short, Jay built his web of trade around the far-flung diaspora that Huguenots had built over a number of decades after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes forced them out of France. But what had initially been a tragedy turned into an opportunity. The act of dispersion built the perfect template for a global trading conglomerate. What was even more interesting was that many individual members of these families appeared almost perfectly English. By the 1740s, Peter Jay's letters were almost all in his adopted language, although he did retire to New Rochelle, one of the largest French communities in British America. Another son of a La Rochelle merchant family, Peter Fanoy, or as we call him in Boston, Peter Faneuil, demonstrated the case even more. Faneuil moved from New York to Boston as a young man, and like Jay, used his family connections to build a robust business. Among other things, he imported French wine on occasion. But while his trade could be French, his lifestyle became more and more English. He left the French church for the Anglican one, while his extraordinary wealth took him to the top of Anglo-American society. In 1743, he funded the construction of the city's central market, Faneuil Hall, which you can see here. When a minister eulogized Faneuil after his death, he did not even think to mention that he was French. Nonetheless, he would have never risen to such a prominent position without his French connections. My second example concerns a very different kind of refugee, those who became active in the military and colonial administration. This was another favored path for well-born sons who found themselves without stable employment. Already in the 1680s, many refugees joined Protestant armies, both in Brandenburg and in England. In particular, many joined the famous French regiment that fought in Ireland during the 1690s, when William and Mary faced off against the deposed King of England, James II. That regiment produced a large number of Huguenot officers and soldiers, some of whom stayed in Ireland, while others moved on to service in the Empire. To demonstrate how military service could bring Huguenots to prominence, I want to focus on one, an officer named Jean-Paul Mascarin. He was born in the city of Castres in Languedoc in 1685, just as the revocation was occurring, actually 1684, just before. His father fled, but young Paul remained with his mother and grandmother in France. Nonetheless, his grandmother in particular made sure that the boy knew of his Protestant heritage, and when he was a teenager, the family arranged to sneak him out of the country to live with his father and uncles in the Netherlands. Sadly, his father died before Paul could reach him, so his relations had to come up with a path for the boy, and they soon settled on the army. By the early 1700s, he was naturalized as an English subject and went off as a soldier to New England. The context was another war between France and England, centered especially on the colony of Acadia. In 1710, the English had conquered this French colony, renaming it Nova Scotia. Mascarene would spend the rest of his long career in that colony, and while he never really liked the place, he escaped to relatively cosmopolitan Boston whenever he could, the posting fit his talents. Unlike any other colony in the British Empire, Nova Scotia was filled with French subjects, the Acadian farmers whose families had lived there for a century. These French neutrals, as they were called, caused headaches for English administrators. After 1713, England and France were at peace, and the Acadians promised to remain neutral in case of future conflict. But for many people, this wasn't good enough. The Acadians should take loyalty oaths or get out, many people believed, including Mascarene, who wrote a report saying as much in 1720. The biggest problem in his eyes was their Catholicism. With seditious priests constantly whispering in their ears, the Acadians could never be loyal. It was better to replace them with good Protestant settlers, and Mascarene knew just the people. He worked with Boston's latest French minister, Andrew Le Mercier, to find Huguenots in New England who would be willing to make a new life in Nova Scotia. The problem there wasn't that there were too many French people, it was just that they had the wrong kind of French people. Alas, Mascarene would never gain fame as the father of a new Huguenot community in Nova Scotia. None of them really wanted to move there. Instead, as his career advanced, he found himself more and more closely linked to the Acadians. The reason was obvious. As Mascarene rose the officers' ranks in the capital of Annapolis Royal, which you can see is actually depicted on the portrait of him in the background, he quickly became the highest-ranked Frenchman. As a native speaker of French, he was in a position to parley with the villagers and their representatives in ways that even his superiors could not. This led to some odd relationships. For instance, Mascarene wrote frequently to a number of priests in the colony, trying to convince them to limit themselves to a spiritual function and remain loyal to the English crown. Rather than kick out the Acadians and their priests, Mascarene hoped to turn them loyal. In one case, he even conducted a lengthy theological debate with a local priest, making a detailed case for the rightness of Protestantism. He did so, he told the priest, because he was the only one in the colony who knew enough French to respond to the priest's erroneous arguments. Like Peter Jay and Peter Faneuil, Paul Mascarene appeared to be very similar to his English neighbors. He married an English woman, gave his children English names, and sent one to Harvard College. He embraced the Church of England, becoming a member of Boston's King's Chapel. When he rose to be acting governor of Nova Scotia, it appeared to be merely the culmination of his transformation from French to English. But there's reason to think that Mascarene's success came not in spite of his Frenchness, but because of it. After all, it was his ability to forge connections with Acadians that gave him particular power. And what's more, it seemed to pay off. In 1744, England and France went to war again, and the French attempted to retake Nova Scotia. They expected help from the Acadians, but most of them chose to remain loyal to their new English rulers. It appeared that Mascarene's gamble had paid off, though of course this didn't prevent a later generation of English rulers from expelling the Acadians during the next conflict. Now, Mascarene's story demonstrated the ways in which being on the margins could be helpful to the Huguenots. Especially in border regions, having intercultural competencies came in helpful. At the same time, it was not wise to appear to be too French. This was the balancing act faced by many refugees in the British Empire, from Ezekiel Carrey back in the 1690s to merchants like Jay and Faneuil in more recent years. Being too French, too unusual, could turn someone into a pariah. But there were ways in which French origins could be useful. A second-generation South Carolina Huguenot said it best in a letter. Quote, "French Protestants, though expatriated, ought not to be so negligent of their origins," he wrote. "It may sometimes be of service to them." The final matter to consider is the larger impact of the North American Huguenots. Were these people really representative or important at all? The answer used to be, of course. The story of America, people used to say, was the story of freedom, and especially of religious freedom. People came to what became the United States to escape tyranny, the tyranny of kings and the tyranny of an overbearing church, which obviously went together. The Huguenots fit this theme perfectly and were celebrated because of it. Ronald Reagan did not mention the Huguenots when he described America as a, quote, shining city on a hill, paraphrasing John Winthrop in the Gospel of Matthew, but he could have. They represented exactly what he thought of American history as a story of freedom men and women coming to America to escape the tyranny of overreaching states. Now, obviously, this line of interpretation has faded in luster, especially among professional historians. The story of America is one of slavery as well as freedom, and there was significant religious persecution alongside the acceptance of some outsiders. Even if one does think acceptance of religious outsiders is a theme of American history, the Huguenots were small in number and faded away quickly. Their story seems to be little more than a footnote in American history, and that is how it is usually treated. Nonetheless, I think the Huguenots were important, but not as exemplars of American freedom. To the contrary, they helped to demolish the old myth of America as a land of promise for persecuted Christians and put something somewhat different in its place. The Huguenots may have come to avoid French persecution, but they emphatically did not come to America to escape state power. To the contrary, they came to America because of the state. It was crown officials in England or local leaders in the colonies who published the tracts that brought the Huguenots across the ocean. And when the refugees wrote petitions lauding their abilities, they sent them to the Lords of Trade and Navigation, the key government agency directing overseas colonization and trade. In short, the creation of a Huguenot community in North America was very much a state project. More than that, pretty much every place that Huguenots went, not just North America, but Germany, Ireland, Southern Africa, they did so at the invitation and with the support of state actors. What is more, the Huguenots were neither the first nor the last religious minorities to play a similar role in state projects, whether in Britain or beyond. In fact, one can see religious toleration in the Atlantic world not as something that emerged organically, as various marginal groups crossed the ocean, but as a deliberate imperial project. European leaders realized that they could use minority groups to accomplish various projects on the edge of empire. This happened at the same time that religious divisions were gripping Europe. What is interesting is that many of the same people who believed in religious uniformity at home advocated toleration in their colonies. The Stuart kings of England, from Charles I to his sons Charles II and James II, operated within this tradition. When Charles I gave the Puritans a patent to go to New England in 1629, he was probably relieved to be rid of some of his most annoying subjects, but he also hoped they would work to create wealth for the empire in their new colony. Same with the Quakers, the most hated people of Restoration England, who nonetheless received their own charters for colonies in the New World that became productive outposts of the empire. The Huguenot migration to America allowed British leaders to theorize toleration and empire like never before. Of course, the Huguenots were in some cases more appealing than the Puritans or Quakers, but they were still a religious minority as well as an ethnic one. Thus, sending them to the empire was a great solution to the problem of diversity in England itself. The 18th century saw this theory applied to any number of other groups. The Palatine refugees in the first decade of the 1700s made arguments for their economic importance that were taken almost word for word from Huguenot petitions, and imperial officials made similar arguments about the economic potential of these Germans. Same with the Salzburgers, persecuted Protestants who in 1734 streamed into England and eventually settled in the new colony of Georgia. Interestingly, these migrants ended up largely devoting themselves to silk, one of the very commodities central to the Huguenot migration. In short, the Huguenots' numbers may have been small, but they played an outsized role in the development of the empire, providing a language for future generations of prospective migrants. Finally, let me return to my original point about margins and centers and the ways in which marginal Europeans prospered on the edges of empire. It is true, European colonies filled up with weird people, and many of those people thought that by heading to the margins they could find freedom and autonomy. This could be true for certain groups at certain times, but if they thought they were escaping Europe's problems, they were sadly mistaken. Instead, the story of groups like the Huguenots showed how Europe was bringing places beyond the seas into its own orbit. Moreover, they were using misfits like Puritans, Huguenots, Palatines, and Salzburgers to do just that. They may have thought that they were building their own autonomous territories, but they were really agents of empire, extending the power of European states over new lands and people. Thank you very much.
Bon, merci beaucoup Owen pour ta présentation où, comme on dit ici, la boucle est bouclée, hein, comment tu es revenu à tes premières idées après avoir fait ta démonstration. Et j'aime beaucoup comment tu décris l'Amérique coloniale comme un weird place. J'ai trouvé ça amusant parce que tu sais sans doute que les États-Unis nous paraissent toujours parfois un endroit bien étrange. Alors, une petite chose, effectivement, pas de vin en Normandie, mais plutôt du cidre. Mais à l'époque, moi, j'ai trouvé, par exemple, un Huguenot en Caroline du Sud qui faisait du vin à Argenteuil. Donc, la géographie viticole du XVIIe siècle en France est beaucoup plus répandue qu'elle ne l'est actuellement. Alors, juste deux remarques pour mettre ton travail en perspective. Il faut savoir que sur la diaspora des Huguenots, ou ce qu'on appelle le refuge depuis le milieu du XIXe siècle, il y a peu de sources en dehors de l'Europe. Donc, pour mener le travail, je veux souligner que pour mener le travail que tu as conduit, disons, sur les Huguenots partout dans le monde, il faut véritablement mener une enquête à la recherche de nouvelles sources. Ça, c'est très important, je voulais vraiment le souligner. C'est vraiment une avancée pour ceux qui s'intéressent à ce sujet, puisque là, tu n'en as pas parlé, mais dans ton livre, tu parles de l'océan Indien, du Suriname, et c'est des endroits où les Huguenots sont allés. On en parle très, très peu, hein, il y a très peu de travaux là-dessus. Donc, tu as une approche à la fois globale et impériale. Hein, c'est vraiment nouveau dans ton travail, où tu montres bien que les décideurs dans ces empires ont voulu utiliser ce réservoir de talent que, en fait, toute migration procure, bien sûr, hier comme aujourd'hui. Justement, tu montres bien avec ce mascarène que, en fait, il est devenu, comme on dirait en anglais, un cultural broker, un imperial cultural broker, qui a été très utile aux Britanniques. Et enfin, donc tu croises ces approches, des études sur le refuge, on pourrait dire des études, disons, migratoires, avec la construction des empires, empire building, et le peuplement des colonies, et aussi l'exploration océanique, bien sûr, parce qu'il y a des destinations, des îles, notamment dans l'océan Indien, très éloignées et peu connues, voire inconnues, en fait. Et dernière remarque, effectivement, puisqu'on étudie la marginalité et le centre, ou le passage des marges au centre, les deux exemples que tu prends de Jay et Faneuil, bon, il faut savoir, si on ne connaît pas très bien le 18e américain, que c'est deux très grandes familles au moment de la Révolution américaine. Donc, ces Huguenots à la marge ont construit, certains d'entre eux ont construit des dynasties sur un siècle, en fait. Et ils étaient, au moment de la Révolution, ils sont véritablement au centre. Voilà, donc merci beaucoup et je laisse la parole à la salle virtuelle, aux salles virtuelles et réelles pour des questions.
Merci beaucoup pour cette intervention. Alors, j'ai été très intéressée finalement par la mobilisation de leurs capitaux, y compris social, de ces Huguenots pour devenir des prominates et finalement en très peu de temps. Est-ce que vous pourriez me donner une idée de combien de générations il faut, en combien de temps finalement ils arrivent à trouver cette centralité que tu évoquais, Bertrand? Ça, c'est ma première question. Et j'ai une question par curiosité. Vous avez évoqué les Allemands. Alors, c'est quelque chose que je connais beaucoup moins bien. Est-ce que par rapport aux Français, il y a une spécificité professionnelle ou sont-ils également des marchands? Et est-ce qu'ils sont vus, considérés différemment par la société d'accueil? Merci.
Thank you for that. So, in terms of your first question about just how long it took, it was relatively quickly because many of the, especially for the merchant families in particular, the first generation of merchants who moved into North America were often people who already had quite a lot of experience and connections in trade there. So I mentioned very briefly Gabrielle Bernal, who was kind of the most prominent person in New England in the 1680s and 90s. And he, in 1685, 1686, went to England and started petitioning authorities both in England and in New England to try to get land, get aid, and he moved there very quickly. And because he was able to trade to the Caribbean, trade later to New France, he did very, very well. And one of the interesting things about him is that in his private papers, there's even correspondence with the governor of Quebec, of New France, the French governor. So he's clearly working both sides in a way. So they're able to get a lot of wealth very quickly, and then they leave that to their children and their grandchildren. So Peter J. and Peter Fanoy are second generation, but they inherit these connections and a fair amount of the wealth of their fathers. So they're they stay prominent. But what's interesting about the second and then especially the third generation is that the French connections fade away. So they have the wealth, but they stop being so connected to French networks and become more similar to just wealthy merchants you would find of other ethnicities. The second question about the Germans, the Germans are an interesting case to compare to the Huguenots, because on one hand, there were far more Germans, so they were very much more prominent. You do see some of the same rhetoric from the English, that the Germans are very hardworking. That's kind of something they often say. They don't talk about specific skills quite as much, although some of them who are from the Rhine do actually know how to make wine. So there is a little bit of that. But it's more just that they're industrious. But they actually face, I would say, a little more, not persecution, but bad feelings from English neighbors. And I think that's really just because there are more of them. So in parts of Pennsylvania, they become dominant, so dominant that they are actually elected to the local assembly and become more powerful politically, and that leads to a backlash. So they end up being, sometimes popular, but sometimes not quite as popular as the Huguenots, who most of the time, most people speak in very glowing terms about the Huguenots because they remain these religious heroes who also seem to have special talents.
Donc, j'ai une question, Owen, parce que ça n'apparaît pas tant dans cette communication, mais plus dans ton ouvrage. Quelle part tu donnerais à l'utopie et à la construction concrète d'empire dans ces migrations lointaines et davantage celles océaniques, disons, plutôt que pour l'Amérique du Nord, même si on retrouve ça pour l'Amérique du Nord.
Mm-hmm. So just the place of utopian thought and its relation to empire. It's a very I didn't mention it in this talk, but as you know, it is a big part of the book, and part of why, I mean, I stressed very much more today kind of the economic and political reasons for Huguenots to come to both America, but to the East Indies as well. But the utopian expectation, I think, is an equally important reason that so many of them were attracted. So if you look at, I mean, as you well know from the work you've done on South Carolina too, if you look at promotional tracts are one part political and economic propaganda and one part utopian imagery. So they talk a lot about You know, the air is perfect, the vegetation is lush. You know, you can live without very much labor in Carolina or Pennsylvania or wherever. And this fits into a long tradition both of European utopian writings, but particularly French and French Protestant utopian writings, which have been very common in the 17th century. So this idea of America as a promised land, but also America as a place where you can make a living and live in peace. I think those two things go together.
Merci. Alors, j'ai une autre question, s'il n'y en a pas d'autres. Puisque tu as vu de nouvelles sources, donc à partir des sources que tu as vues, quelle part de crédit tu accordes à ce qu'on lit parfois sur la volonté de retour en France, soit en 1697 après le traité de Ruymbeke, ou encore peut-être en 1713 après Utrecht? Parce que c'est quelque chose qui apparaît régulièrement, mais je voulais savoir si avec les nouvelles sources que tu as vues, et surtout dans ce travail global, pas juste sur l'Amérique du Nord, ce que tu penses de ce point.
I have not found many examples of people of people who go back and talk about it. This is a constant worry from 1688, 89 onward, that people are going to get frustrated, especially as things get worse for the refugees in Europe. They say, well, they're just going to come back to France and become Catholics because there's no opportunities for them. So this is part of the argument for finding new places for them to live, so that they can you know, avoid going back to France. There is an expectation or a hope among many people, especially early on, that the refuge will be temporary. That by the middle of the 1690s, they expect you know, England and the Netherlands will win in the war, and they'll be able to negotiate the return of the Huguenots as Protestants. So that is definitely something that they're hoping for. After 1697, that fades pretty quickly. And you know, just to get at your comment about sources, there's a very interesting set of letters by a merchant in New York named Thomas Bayeux, back to his relatives in Normandy. And one of the things he says in 1715, he writes to them, this is after Louis XIV has died. And so this is a great moment. There's peace again. And he says to his relatives, he's like, I really wish I could see you. I miss my family so much, but I'll never come back to France. I'm in New York now. This is my community. I'm British, essentially. So I think there was kind of a moment, especially by the early 18th century, when these people, they still were French in certain ways. They spoke French at home. They maintained those connections with France, but they were no longer thinking of going back to France.
Oui, oui, je sais pas si j'ai bien compris, mais bon, vous me direz, monsieur. Et j'ai beaucoup aimé cette conclusion qui dit que quelque part que les puissances européennes utilisaient les marges des autres pays au royaume ou aux nations en formation, quelque part afin de tirer quelques profits à leur avantage ou de construire leur propre territorialité, parce que ils sont en concurrence. Il me semble ça je trouve que c'est quelque chose, disons que je l'avais pensé pour des périodes plus contemporaines, mais bon, là, ça, je trouve que c'est quelque chose de très intéressant, de très contemporain aussi, je pense. Et la France, particulièrement, par exemple, la question indienne au Mexique, c'est en Amérique latine en général. Mais jusqu'à quel point, disons, là, on dirait que c'est beaucoup plus fort qu'actuellement. Hein, ces puissances encouragent les dissensions des marginaux, c'est ça que j'ai compris, alors que dans leur pays et royaume, on n'accepte pas ces minorités. Ça, je trouve, je trouve cette phrase, si vous l'avez dit comme ça, ça éclaire énormément de choses. Est-ce que vous pensez que c'était plus fort à l'époque que dans l'époque contemporaine ou voilà, c'est un peu moins. Et
Ouais.
ça est une question par rapport à la stabilisation de ces familles qui migrent, mais ça, je ne sais pas si c'est pertinent. C'est bon, la deuxième génération, mais comme c'est pas, bon, d'après ce que j'ai compris, n'est pas une immigration directe, France, États-Unis, mais France, Allemagne, Suisse et ensuite les États-Unis. Voilà. Est-ce que c'est la deuxième génération? Mais déjà, il y a eu combien de générations ou combien de temps ces gens-là ont pu passer, je ne sais pas, en Allemagne, en Suisse, etc., pour ensuite émigrer. Bon, parce qu'ils émigraient sûrement avec déjà peut-être un capital ou quelque chose. Voilà, ces deux questions. Bon, là c'est plutôt bon, quelque chose que je trouve très, très bien, cette approche, très, très bien dite. Là, bon, à la limite, à quelle époque c'était plus fort, cette intervention. Hein. Et la deuxième, bon, que c'est plus factuel.
Merci.
Ouais.
It's a very good point about. I mean, I'm a early modern historian, so I can comment less well on the contemporary period, but I think that many of the patterns, especially thinking about engineering populations and kind of moving people around, that's such a part of colonialism, not just in the early modern period, but the modern period starts in the 17th century. And I think in some ways the real start of it is not what I've talked about today, but what Spain tries to do in the 16th century with its Sephardic Jewish population and its Morisco population. So this idea of, whether you're expelling minorities or kind of moving minorities from one place to another, I think that's a practice that starts during this period, but becomes kind of something that I think you could find lots of different examples of in the modern period. And I even saw, in living in the United States, when we, with refugees have been very much in the news over the past 5 or 6, 7 years. And I remember in a city that I used to live in that I know well, St. Louis, Missouri, there were people saying, well, we want Syrian refugees. Our economy has declined. We need industrious settlers here. And I read this. I was like, oh, this sounds exactly like the Huguenots. So there definitely still that kind of that kind of dialogue. And your second question is about the. Could you maybe repeat that? It's about the second generation of refugees, of migrants.
Oui, on vous a demandé en combien de temps les personnes qui arrivent, les Huguenots qui arrivent, réussissent à avoir la centralité qu'ils acquièrent avec le temps. Et votre réponse était qu'à peu près c'était la deuxième génération et que la troisième génération tendait à s'éloigner de la France. Mais la question que je me pose, c'est comment c'est pas une immigration directe, oui, mais elle passe d'abord par l'Allemagne ou par la Suisse. Je veux dire, est-ce qu'il y a une génération et deux. Voilà.
D'accord. It depends. So for some, it is true. It's almost nobody goes directly from France to America. There's always an intermediate stop. For many people, it's a fairly short intermediate stop. So in the 1680s, so most people leave in 1685, 86, 87, and maybe they live for a year, 2 years in Germany or in the Netherlands or in London, and then there's no opportunities there, so then they go to America. For some, it's a little longer. So the Virginia migrants who come in 1700, so they've been in England or Europe for 10 years, but there's not much second generation. We don't see many people who come in the 18th century, a few, but not very many, who have been living in England, for example. Paul Mascarin is maybe one example, but he's a kind of outlier, I would say. So for the most part, it's people who have not spent that much time in England itself.
D'accord, merci beaucoup.
Est-ce que je peux poser rapidement une dernière question parce que je sais on est tenu par le couvre-feu, donc je ne vais pas traîner. Dans la réponse que vous donniez, Owen, à une des questions lors de cette conversation, vous disiez du cas d'un Français qui aurait pu envisager un retour. Il répondait « Maintenant, I am British ». Et c'est le terme « British » qui m'a beaucoup frappée. J'ai une question, une curiosité. Justement, c'est le terme British qui est utilisé ou est-ce qu'il y a déjà la conscience d'une forme d'américanité? Je pense par rapport au cas latino-américain, hispano-criollo.
Yes, great question. And I think that I'd have to look at the letter, but I believe what he said in the letter was that I'm British. I think he uses some form. I don't remember if he said English or British, and I'm a New Yorker. So his identity that he expressed in that letter was both, I think, an allegiance to the king that he considered his ruler at this point, and he's a naturalized subject of the king, and his allegiance to a particular town, to his city, where he lived and had connections. In terms of the question of American or North American identity is very, very, it's one that historians have tried to examine for a long time. And I think it is in this period, until the revolutionary period, and maybe even the post-revolutionary period, you sometimes find some people calling themselves Americans, but very rarely. It would be much more common to call themselves either British or a New Englander, a Pennsylvanian, a Carolinian, which is one of the reasons why it was so difficult to build a nation coming out of the American Revolution. It took a while.
Merci, Owen.
Merci.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Owen.